Hello and welcome to a special GZERO media presentation from the 2025 Munich Security Conference. I'm David Sanger, the White House and National Security Correspondent for the New York Times, and this conversation is part of the Global Stage series, a partnership between GZERO and Microsoft. We're coming to you from the Bayerischerhof Hotel, which is sort of the home to the Super Bowl of global security. And today we're going to talk a little bit about the rifts that we saw take place in this conference as dozens of world leaders gathered at one of the most critical and tense times in the Western alliance. But we'll also dive into some cybersecurity issues and the increasing threats posed on the cyber landscape. There may not be a world war happening right now, fortunately, but our world is very much at war in conflicts from Ukraine to the Middle East to Sudan, and then to more hidden battles, ones you do not see as they escalate through cyberspace with digital threats to critical infrastructure, and of course, the use of offensive weapons. So to kick us off today, I am joined by Ian Bremmer, the founder and president of the Eurasia Group and GZERO Media, by Brad Smith, the vice chair and president of Microsoft, and Roberta Metsola, the president of the European Parliament. So before we talk about the cyber threat landscape, and there's lots to do there, I want to talk a little bit about what's happened here at the 61st Munich Security Conference, which was filled with all kinds of examples of the kind of geopolitical risk that you, Ian, have been writing about. You think you said that 2025 was the year that the GZERO world wins. But what I want to do, I think, is start with you, President Metsola. These gatherings have frequently become sort of the testing point of the schisms in the world political order, or at least the West. And I think that has been true more this year than most. We've had a new U.S. administration that has had to go work its way through positions on Ukraine, on a series of other conflicts. We saw European leaders step out in great protest that they felt that they were being excluded from the negotiations over the future of Ukraine. I can't recall in the years that I've come here quite as much contention as the one we've seen now. Tell us what you saw and why you think that came to a head this week.
Well, I think we were sort of expecting it. For months now, we've looked at what will essentially be a very different way of discussion across the Atlantic. And I think a realization that has happened months ago in the European Union that voters want their political representatives to act faster and to act with determination and mostly self-confidence. I think Europe has not shown that self-confidence enough, and these last few days have laid it bare. I think the one thing that I can take away, which surprised me the most, is that there is a sort of doubt about what we would call freedom of expression here, or protection of free speech in Europe. You know, looking at Europe and being here in Munich, looking back just a generation ago, countries were behind the Iron Curtain, where there was no freedom at all. We fought a lot to get that freedom, and today we defend those freedoms. We could discuss as to whether we're doing well from a competition perspective, from a cybersecurity perspective, investment in defense, but I would not let's say, agree with any question as to whether freedom of speech is protected here. We can get offended, you can insult each other. Of course, there's a borderline with what is incitement to violence or hatred, but we really do that job well, and our values are protected. And I think that that's where we have to be sort of coherent, and when we push back against any narrative that would be inclined to believe otherwise.
So we heard from Vice President J.D. Vance, and he was interesting. He went and took a tour of the Dachau concentration camp, and then he came here and he gave this speech in which he criticized European leaders for cutting out a whole segment of society. And what he clearly meant was the right wing. Here, he basically said, you've got to allow them to join a government and not freeze them out. He said, this is not a time for firewalls. It was pretty shocking to his German hosts, who, for decades have tried to make sure that those who utter words that are reminiscent of a much uglier era in European history did not end up in government. How do you see that playing out?
Well, in the European Parliament, which is the institution I preside over, this is a discussion we have every day. You have different political groups, people coming together, majorities being formed. I will not speculate as to what the outcome of the German election in a week will be. However, what I would ask is that the German citizens are given the freedom to choose who they want to vote for. And then it is up to us in the European Union, in each member state, to see what kind of government will give you stability. Whenever we have elections in any country, essentially what are people asking for? Protection to have a job, to have a roof over your head, and that your children can walk safely in the street. That is essentially, in a nutshell, what voters want from us. Which political parties are going to present that, are going to offer that? And I think the risk is, rather than be worried about the extremes, is that whether the traditional parties can still continue to present that as an offering to the voters. For many years, that didn't happen, and we're needing to claw that back. In some countries, the pendulum has started to swing, but the center, for it to hold, needs to be ready to counter any narrative that would project extremism. And also, perhaps, one thing to say is that individual fringe groupings are different in each country. And you need to recognize that citizens can choose who they think will best represent them. Sometimes it's an experiment, sometimes it's a protest vote, sometimes it's a non-vote at all. But this is a day, I would say, a year, 2025, and you've been projecting what this year will look like. This is a year where our voters will say, can you deliver on what we think are our biggest hopes, but also fears? And that, I think, brings us to a more relevant point, rather than whether you exclude parties from government or not.
So, Ian, let me just turn to you for just a moment on this, because you've been to a lot of these over the years, as we all have, but this year seemed to show that there was this division not only on the issues of free speech, but very different visions of regulation in the tech world, generally around the world. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what you think you heard differently here, because we have heard basically from the Americans a sort of no regulation world that they want to head to. And we've heard from the Europeans, well, that's fine when you're operating in the U.S. market. That's not the way you're going to operate here in Europe.
Well, of course, before the Munich Security Conference, you had the AI summit in Paris, and J.D. Vance, who gave a speech there that was actually quite cogent and
Yep.
Showing off that he understands technology and the Americans have young people and all the rest. But it was very much a message to the Europeans saying, we're going to do this our way, and you're going to have to follow. And in that regard, it was very consistent. And I think, look, this is not the first time the Munich Security Conference has been shocked. And certainly you and I were here right after the Russians invaded Ukraine. And there was a shock in how the Europeans would respond to that, because everybody thought that this was going to be a peaceful continent. We didn't have to spend so much on defense, and suddenly they have to pay more attention. But now they're fighting a second front. The big difference between Trump and previous administrations is that the Trump administration is convinced that a strong Europe is not good for the United States. They don't want the European Union to work as a cohesive unit. They want individual relations with countries and movements that support them, the Make Europe Great Again folks. And that's a very serious problem for the Europeans.
Certainly is. We're going to have to take a short break here to allow President Metsola to go on to her next stuff. Brad, we're going to pick up with you right after that break, but just hold on and be with us, and we will be diving into more issues on regulation and on the security threat landscape with former U.S. Deputy National Security Advisor Ann Neuberger, who's going to join us. Stay with us. We're back with GZERO's Global Stage series from the 2025 Munich Security Conference. Brad Smith from Microsoft and Ian Bremmer from the Eurasia Group are still with us, but we're now joined by a good friend, former Deputy National Security Advisor Ann Neuberger, who's just left the Biden administration. Let me pick up first, Brad, with the conversation we were just having before the break on regulation. So, as Ian pointed out, J.D. Vance gave this very well composed accounting of an artificial intelligence policy. What I took away from it were three things: that he said the U.S. would dominate on the hardware for artificial intelligence. We've got long ways to go from that, since the United States doesn't make most of that hardware. The U.S. will dominate on the software, and it will set the rules, and there won't be many of them. And that Europe could do all the rest. So I'm wondering if you could sort of tell us how you think your fellow executives in the tech world, who have been understandably concerned about the regulatory environment in Europe, took the speech.
Well, I think Vice President Vance gave a very cogent speech, as you just said, and I think to a significant degree there have been reservations across the tech sector about certain aspects of technology regulation, certainly in Europe, but in other places as well. But I think it's also important to put all of this in the broader geopolitical context that you all were just talking about. As you've said, David, this is a more contentious time for international relations. I think it's fair to say it's a more uncertain time. And I think we don't choose the government. We don't get to select the laws. But we play a very important role as a company and indeed as an industry. First in the United States, we're an American technology industry, but really around the world. Certainly, Microsoft is spending billions of dollars to build out AI and digital infrastructure in Canada and in Mexico. We're spending tens of billions of dollars to do the same thing across every corner of the European Union. And as President von der Leyen said, the EU has now had to go through 3 crises in half a decade. It's why we come to the Munich Security Conference. The first was the pandemic. We helped European hospitals and schools and governments transition to the cloud in 2020 in a matter of days to sustain this economy. And then 2 years later, when the war started in Ukraine, we responded instantly and persistently, providing $250 million of free assistance to defend Ukraine. And as Europe now addresses its competitiveness crisis, I believe our role is actually more important than ever. Because the only way to sustain European growth, to advance productivity, is through technology. In many instances, our technology. And I think fundamentally, we work under different governments. We always have, we always will. And at the same time, in a source of instability, we need to be a source of stability. And our message, I think, to all of Europe needs to be clear. Our support for Europe is not only steady, but steadfast. It always will be, even when we have governments that disagree on issues.
Well, that's really fascinating, because it may turn out that the corporate world is much more stable across boundaries than we're going to see in the political world. And let me bring you into this. So we've seen a range of cyber threats that have been playing out many ways with the same countries that have been involved in the Ukraine war. The biggest threats that you were dealing with when you were at the White House were China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, all players in Ukraine as well. And yet, because we were so focused on Ukraine here, I'm not quite sure there was quite as much discussion as I would have expected, and I think there would have been a normal year, about what the biggest threats are and how they've changed since the last time we were all here. So take us for a moment through particularly China and Russia, but all 4 of them, and what you saw just as you were leaving your 4 years at the White House.
Absolutely. So the geopolitical tensions that you've been talking about, they play out in cyberspace. They play out with regard to countries in cyberspace, and they play out with regard to sometimes groups aligned with countries, or sometimes financially driven, and the impact they're having as well. A practical example is, the evening before Russia invaded Ukraine, Russia conducted a cyber attack on a company providing satellite services to Ukraine's military. Disrupted Ukraine's military's ability to communicate, And but for really Starlink stepping in to provide those communications, it would have had a practical impact there. Similarly, we've seen China pre-positioning infrastructure around the world and countries starting to step up to say what's needed to do to deter or counter that. And finally, criminal groups, often provided safe haven by countries like Russia, are impacting infrastructure around the world, notably a significant growth in the healthcare sector through ransomware attacks. So those same geopolitical tensions that we see in physical space certainly are playing out in digital space as well.
So, Ian, talk to us a little bit about what we've learned in the past year about deterrence in this space, because as Anne points out, the early attacks in Ukraine were cyber. They were then followed by kinetic attacks through the way. We've seen in the United States an extraordinary and somewhat sophisticated approach by the Chinese to get into, Chinese intelligence, to get into the telecom systems so deeply that they were able to hear conversations, we're not entirely sure how much they listened to, from President Trump and Vice President Vance. They were able to get into systems that U.S. law enforcement uses to tap the phones of suspected criminals. It was a pretty big breach. And yet, it doesn't seem like we've got a working theory of deterrence here.
Well, I mean, there was deterrence, of course, against Russian cyber attacks for a brief period of time after Biden met with Putin, and they hadn't met before, president to president.
That was 2021.
That was 2021. I think June or July. It was in Geneva.
That's right.
Not far from here. Right. And they didn't talk much about Ukraine, but they talked a lot about cyber because it was right after the Colonial Pipeline hit. And Biden made it very clear in that meeting that that was a red line. And if there were critical infrastructure attacks by Russians going forward, that the Russians were going to pay for it. And we absolutely saw that the Russians, sort of pulled back as a consequence of that. Now, that lasted until it didn't. And when the Russians decide they're going to invade a sovereign country, after Putin directly met with other world leaders, European leaders, and bald-facedly lied and said, no, we have absolutely no plans to invade. And then he invades, all bets are off. And if the GZERO world is winning, one of the things that's also winning is impunity. One of the things that's also winning is a failure of deterrence. And if the North Koreans have a defensive alliance with Russia and they're sending 15,000 troops to the front lines inside Russia to fight the Ukrainians, they're not going to be as easily deterred either. Now, I do think that with Iran, who recognize, they're the ones that have lost in all of this. Of the four that you've mentioned, the rogues that are causing most of the cyber concerns, the Iranians have lost their empire by proxy across the Middle East. And they've lost it because the Israelis, with American support, have shown that they have escalation dominance in the region. And also because Assad had a kleptocratic and brutally brittle regime that fell domestically. So if you're Iran right now, maybe you can talk about going dashing to a nuclear weapon. You're going to get hit if that happens. But the idea that you can act with impunity compared to 6 months ago, 12 months ago, has been really wiped off the agenda. But that's hard power, and that's not credibility of international actors around the world.
Absolutely. And Brad, you wrote a terrific book a couple of years ago about the tools and weapons involved in all of this. But from that book, one of the things you were most concerned about was that as governments, we haven't quite figured out the deterrence element of this. You've been a little bit part of this. When that attack by what's called Salt Typhoon was found, it was actually Microsoft that found it first and went to the U.S. government. You were able to find it, but you weren't, of course, able to counter it. That's going to be pretty much government's role. So tell us a little bit about that. And tell us about how good a job you think we have done or not done in deterring all of this in the future. With the Chinese, despite the fact they got caught by you, come back and do it again.
Well, the first thing I would say is the state of cybersecurity protection in 2025 is far better than it was when the decade began, not the least of which because of people like Ann Neuberger. The government has done more, the private sector has done more, and we have done more together. And as you point out, it's this ability to collaborate and share information that is an indispensable element of defending our countries. At the same time, the challenges continue to evolve. And to some degree, they too become more serious. Salt Typhoon showed what China could do to penetrate the telecommunications infrastructure of the United States and many other countries. Ransomware has continued not only to grow, but to some degree explode. We saw a 252% increase in ransomware last year alone. And the victims of those kinds of attacks are often hospitals, schools, local governments, often the least financed and the sort of least secure of our institutions. And what they find themselves doing is transferring money in budgets they often don't really have overseas to criminal organizations. Over half of what we see goes to Russia and Iran. So this is the right time for us to have the next stage of this conversation. Some of this ransomware is fundamentally, in our view, either state-sponsored or certainly state-tolerated. And there should be no room for that.
And that problem's a lot worse than it was when you saw President Biden meet with Putin and basically make those post-colonial pipeline threats, which takes me, Anne, to a question you and I have had for a long time, debated for a long time. So the new administration has come in and they said, okay, we know how we're going to restore deterrence. We're going to go on the offense. They hit us, they're going to get hit in all kinds of ways, which is a great theory until you ask the question, and then what, right? And particularly if your systems are not as well boarded up as you would like them to be. And as Brad points out, the ransomware problem's a whole lot worse now than when that meeting took place in Geneva in 2021. So if you were giving advice to your successors here, what would you tell them they need to do if they're going to make a bigger offensive strategy work?
If one prepares to throw a punch, one has to be prepared to think about what the next move will be in response. So in many ways, the shift the United States has made to more of a European model of requiring minimum cybersecurity for the most important parts of critical services, ports, hospitals, airports, is really to have them shore up their defenses. That stronger defense fundamentally then enables governments to go more on offense. What does offense mean? Practically considering what is the message one seeks to convey, what's the outcome, and begin with that outcome in mind. So for example, if the outcome is to say these particular kinds of targets, hospitals for example, are off limits, and any attempt to disrupt the operations of a hospital will be met with a response, then when that message is conveyed, there has to be something that demonstrates that there is consequences for that kind of activity. So
Right.
that would be one example there.
A really, really good example. Ian, do you think the U.S. government, even in its new aggressive pose, is willing to do that and do it, do that kind of response, and do it in a way that would be visible and would send a message? Or do you think our vulnerabilities just are so great that when they all get in the Situation Room, they're going to say, hey, before we, go full cowboy on this whole thing, let's think a little bit about what it will look like if someone actually does shut down part of the utility grid?
Look, on the one hand, everything we've been talking about so far should give us reason for more confidence. The technological capabilities have grown. People are very much more aware of the kinds of threats. That's not just true in the U.S., but also with partners around the world. The private sector is much more robust, and they're working together in collaboration with the governments, especially in the United States. All of that is great. But the United States, as you know, is not just a government that has elections every 4 years, but also is a government that is kind of an experiment. It's an experiment of, sort of robust institutions on the basis of shared norms and values. And those values and norms are being tested right now. The institutions are being tested right now. We know that inside the United States, we now have a process where a lot of critical employees are being fired. They're being shot first and questions are being asked later.
Right.
Some of those people are in charge of nuclear facilities, for example, then they're being brought back. That leads to questions about how well, the ability of the Americans to execute and the willingness to test institutions in ways that would actually undermine that credibility. I mean, when you see people from outside of the government that are demanding access, read-only access, but nonetheless access into sort of treasury transfers, for example, you create more vulnerabilities for the United States. When you demand lists of employees from the CIA and it's given out in an unclassified email, you create vulnerabilities that the Chinese will certainly take advantage of. So it's not just USAID, soft power gets shut down and the Chinese have the ability to come in and deliver some of that aid. Sure, that's true, but this is fundamentally a bigger question that doesn't get as much attention on the national security side. And I think we should all have questions about that.
We should, and we only have a minute or so left, but I wanted to ask Brad and Ann basically the same question. Are we now in the course of what's going on in Washington, getting rid of employees in this mass way, going into these computer systems? Does it worry you that we are creating the kinds of holes that the Chinese and the Russians, the Iranians, the North Koreans would just love to exploit?
I think it's a little bit too early to know, but I think it is a good reminder. Certainly we appreciate as a company the extraordinarily critical role across the national security and law enforcement landscape that people play, civil servants, people who've dedicated their professional careers to protecting the United States, to protecting the schools and hospitals we're talking about here. So that doesn't mean that there's not an opportunity to make the government more efficient, but it does mean that one always needs to take care not to move faster than the speed of thought.
And you get the last and brief word here, but is cybersecurity an area where first do no harm actually applies? And are you concerned we are doing some harm right now?
I think that's very right to say, first do no harm, and a great deal of progress has been made over the last few years, securing government systems, having the most important private sector systems take cybersecurity seriously, and even more importantly, bringing governments and private sector together around the world in digital solidarity to secure cyberspace, because so much of our economies and national security relies on that. That takes talented people working together every day, and I think, to Brad's point, it's too early to tell, but it is important to always consider that the most sophisticated adversaries around the world are eager to gain access to important ports and government systems alike. So considering cybersecurity is a foundational step.
No reason to make it easier for them.
Okay.
Well, that does it for us here in Munich. You can see more of the GZERO coverage from this conference and all the content from the Global Stage series at gzeromedia.com/global stage. I want to thank Ian Bremmer and Brad Smith and Ann Neuberger, as well as the European Parliament President, Roberta Metsola, who had to leave us a few minutes ago, for your time today. And I want to thank all of you for watching this around the world. I'm David Sanger. Have a great day and a great week ahead.